Hey guys, tonight we begin not with a philosopher or a king, but with something far more dangerous and complicated. Dating in the Middle Ages. Because believe it or not, finding love in a time of plagues, dowries, and chaperones was somehow even more awkward than texting someone, "What you doing?" at 2 a.m. And let me know in the comments where you're retuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. From courtly love songs to marriage by livestock negotiation, medieval romance was less about butterflies and more about land rights. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. So you're restanding in a medieval village, or maybe a chilly stone castle, wondering how to find love. Maybe strike up a conversation, compliment someone's hose, ask if they come here often. Nope, that's not how any of this works. If you're in the Middle Ages, dating in the modern sense doesn't really exist. You don't flirt, text, or go for long walks to see where it goes. Instead, your parents or your lord or your abbot are already deciding who you'll marry, when, and how many cows it will take to seal the deal. If you're a noble, you've probably been betrothed since before your voice dropped. You and your future spouse might meet for the first time on your wedding day. And yes, that's just as uncomfortable as it sounds. The whole thing is about land titles and family alliances, not compatibility or how good they are at lute solos. If you're a peasant, things are slightly less formal, but only slightly. Your family still has a strong say, and love isn't really part of the discussion. Maybe your parents know a nice girl whose family owns a productive goat. Maybe they admire a boy who can thatch a roof without falling off. Boom. You're courting now. Lucky you. It's not that people in the Middle Ages don't feel romantic. They do. It's just not the priority. The goal is survival, inheritance, and social stability. Falling in love before marriage, that's risky. Falling in love outside of marriage, that's scandalous. Either way, it's frowned upon unless you're a character in a tragic poem, in which case, go wild. And yet, you dream. Maybe you write a little verse on a scrap of parchment. Maybe you sneak a glance across the market. Maybe, just maybe, you fall for someone who wasn't pre-approved by your family's livestock appraiser. But for now, you wait. You obey. You try not to fall for the miller's apprentice, because in this world, love might be the goal of poets, but marriage is the work of parents, priests, and politics. So you think someone's cute. Maybe it's the way they balance a basket of onions on their head. Maybe it's the confident way they beat mud off a rug. Your medieval heart skips a beat, but steady yourself, because in this world, romance doesn't bloom without a balance sheet. Before you even think about courtship, you'd better ask, what do I bring to the table? And if your answer is a charming personality, you might want to sit down. If you're a young man, you'll need land or livestock or tools or a roof that doesn't leak too much. Love letters are nice, but nothing says husband material like 2 healthy oxen and a roof that can survive a mild storm. If your father has already promised the best goat to your brother, well, you might want to consider the priesthood. If you're a young woman, your family needs a dowry. It could be coin, clothing, or a suspiciously generous number of geese. Doesn't matter how witty you are. If your family can't pay up, you're likely to spend a long time perfecting your embroidery alone. Now let's say you actually like someone who makes your callous heart flutter. You lock eyes at the well. There's a spark. It's romantic, it's poetic, it's completely irrelevant, because unless your families are on equal financial footing, you might as well fall in love with a cloud. If you're noble, it gets worse. Your hand in marriage is tied to land borders and political favors. You're not just a person. You're a walking treaty. Congratulations. Even peasants aren't safe. Marriage is practical. You don't marry for butterflies. You marry because your pig pen borders someone else's wheat field. You dream of passion. You settle for irrigation rights. And yet you try. Maybe you offer a small gift, a carved spoon, a handful of berries, or your finest, slightly cracked mug. Maybe they smile. Maybe they don't, but the truth remains. In medieval dating, economics is the flirting, and love is just a bonus you hope your spouse develops eventually. So let's say you're not a peasant worrying about pigs or a noble dealing with treaties. Let's say you're a knight shiny armor, big horse, questionable poetry skills. What's your love life like? Welcome to the strange and emotionally exhausting world of courtly love. Now, this isn't dating. This is performance art. Courtly love was a noble pastime, part flirting, part spiritual suffering, and entirely impractical. You, the brave knight, choose a noble lady, usually one who's already married, and vow to adore her from afar, not physically. Of course, that would ruin everything. No, you're supposed to suffer elegantly. You might compose a few tortured verses about her silver laugh, or how her hair burns like the sun, which in medieval terms means she has hair and didn't insult your family. You wear her colors at tournaments. You pine. You sigh. You occasionally joust someone just because he glanced at her too long, the lady's role. She is supposed to pretend this is all very flattering while maintaining a level of icy detachment that would terrify a glacier. She may respond with a letter, a token, maybe a ribbon, but mostly she'd just be mysterious and unattainable, which is the entire point. The emotions are high, the actual contact minimal at best. You might get a nod from across the hall or a finger brushed against your gauntlet during a feast. Anything more, and suddenly it's not courtly love. It's a scandal or worse, adultery, and no one wants that, at least not officially. This entire setup worked best when everyone involved agreed. It was mostly pretend. It was a way to express longing, devotion, and creative angst, all without disrupting the social order. A medieval venting mechanism, if you will. Was it dramatic? Absolutely. Did it involve more poetry than practicality? So you weren't born a samurai. No sword, no poetry. No chance of dramatic ritual disembowelment. That's the good news. The bad news? You're a peasant, which means your entire existence is a combination of dirt, sweat, back pain, and government-mandated rice delivery. But in feudal Japan, meals aren't about indulgence. They're about survival, simplicity, and not choking on a fishbone in front of your in-laws. If you're a peasant, your diet is rice. Rice for breakfast, rice for lunch, rice for dinner. If you're lucky, it's actual rice. If you're not, it's barley pretending to be rice. Maybe you get a turnip, maybe some pickled radish, if the gods are feeling generous. Meat? That's for the daimyo, or for the one chicken that looked at you funny and mysteriously vanished. Fish, sometimes, but it's dried, salted, and sharp enough to file your teeth. Soup? Usually miso, if you can call hot salted water with 2 floating leaf soup. Flavorful, yes, in the same way seawater is hydrating. Now, if you're a samurai, you do get better food, but you eat last. After your lord, his guests, and whoever else he's decided to impress. That means cold rice, cold soup, and the deep spiritual exercise of watching others eat while pretending you're honored to wait. Everything is seasonal, not because it's trendy, but because there's no refrigeration, no global supply chain, and if you don't harvest it, it doesn't exist. Winter is just nature's way of suggesting fasting. And heaven forbid you get food poisoning. Medical care is ... optimistic. The local cure is usually lie down and think about your ancestors. You'll either get better or join them. Steal food? That's serious. Touch the daimyo's daikin, and you'll learn what the phrase, public example, really means. Tea exists, but not the cozy kind. The tea ceremony is a performance of etiquette and existential humility, not refreshment. So yes, meals are sacred, quiet, and respectful. But mostly, they're small, bland, and always contain at least one crunchy mystery item. And no, you can't complain. Not unless you want your next meal served through your nose. You wake up with the sun, not because you're in tune with nature, but because the land tax won't pay itself. Maybe your neighbor insists his cow can predict the weather. And for one reckless, foolish moment, you think about correcting them. Don't. In feudal Japan, your opinion is a liability. Free speech is not a concept. It's a fast track to disgrace, exile, or sudden career-ending decapitation. The social hierarchy is rigid, and every word has weight. Speak above your class, you're being impudent. Criticize someone above you, you're insolent. Make a joke that doesn't land, that's treason adjacent. Even within families, you tread carefully. A son doesn't interrupt his father. A wife doesn't correct her husband. And no one, absolutely no one, questions the daimyo, unless they've always wanted to explore the afterlife via sword tip. Samurai are trained to speak with measured calm, even when furious. A sharp tongue is worse than a dull blade. It's unbecoming, it's dangerous, and it might force someone into the awkward position of having to kill you just to restore their honor. Which brings us to apologies. In feudal Japan, apologies are an art form. You don't just say sorry. You bow. You grovel. You possibly write a poem about your shame. You might even send a gift, like a live bird or a decorative comb, while sincerely hoping the person receiving it doesn't decide to duel you anyway. And God's help you if your tone is too casual. A misplaced word can be interpreted as sarcasm, defiance, or... And also, your thatched hut has no doors, no windows, and someone's goat just walked across your bed mat. Breakfast? If you're lucky, a bowl of rice porridge and a side of last week's pickled something. If you're not, it's pretend you're not hungry with a splash of river water. Then it's off to the rice fields, which sound peaceful in documentaries, but in reality, are mud pits designed to break your spirit over 12 exhausting hours. You plant, you weed, you hope there's no bandit raid today. And when the sun goes down, you limp home, only to find one of your oxen is missing, and the village headman would like a word about your grain shortfall. Taxes are relentless. You don't get paid in coins, you pay with rice. Your family eats what's left, which isn't much, especially if the harvest was bad, or if your lord's nephew rode a horse through your field during a military drill. Want to complain? That's adorable. You can't. Talking back gets you whipped, exiled, or promoted to corpse. If you're lucky, you might become a village elder, which means people still don't listen to you. But now they ask for your advice first. And you're legally not allowed to leave your village without permission. You are, in effect, a rice-based prisoner with seasonal ankle rot. There are festivals, sometimes. You drink sweet sake, dance in a circle, and try not to think about how planting season starts again in 4 days. So yes, you are the foundation of the economy, the reason the samurai eat, and the person everyone forgets exists. And no, you do not get a day off, because feudal Japan believes in hard work, generational suffering, and keeping expectations extremely, extremely low. You're hungry. Of course you are. You've been tilling, planting, sweating, and politely not dying since sunrise. Time to eat. So you've just finished your modest bowl of crunchy, maybe fish soup. Someone says something absurd. Maybe your lord mumbles a bad haiku. Maybe your village elder misquotes a proverb. Priests gave sermons about proper conduct and wrote lengthy treatises on the dangers of flirtation. Yes, that's right, medieval clergy published anti-flirting manuals. Imagine someone copying those out by candlelight, while monks silently judge you from across the scriptorium. Even letter writing wasn't safe. Some monasteries opened love letters just to screen for moral content. That's right divine censorship. So if you want to fall in love, you'll have to get used to doing it quietly and in the presence of your entire extended family, and possibly God. So you're in love, or at least medieval in love, which is mostly longing, confusion, and a lot of pacing near windows. You've exchanged glances across a feast. Maybe they picked up your dropped handkerchief and didn't immediately throw it into the fire. The tension is unbearable. But still, you can't speak freely. There are chaperones, priests, mothers, lurking like emotional border patrol agents. So what do? You write a letter. Ah yes, the secret love letter, the most dangerous piece of parchment since the excommunication notice. This is your chance to confess your heart using the most cryptic, overly poetic language possible. Because you can't just say, I like you. No, you must say, my soul is a stag pierced by the arrow of your grace, roaming the forests of yearning. Naturally, if you're literate, which, let's be honest, isn't it giving you pen your message on vellum or rough parchment? If you're really dedicated, you dust it with flower petals or a whisper of perfume. Just be careful with that. One noble accidentally used a love letter to wrap a herring and delivered it to the wrong girl. They're married now. It's fine. Now comes the problem of delivery. You can't just hand it over. You need a courier, a loyal servant, a bribed monk, or a younger sibling with limited understanding of consequences. Sometimes even a minstrel would do the job, singing your poem in the town square while pretending it was anonymous. Subtle. And the poetry? Risky. Very risky. The line between romantic and heresy was thinner than a monk's patience during Lent. If your metaphor even hinted at anything physical, you might find yourself confessing to both lust and literary exaggeration. But despite all the rules, people did write. Some letters survived. Some poems were copied and passed around like forbidden fruit. In a world of rigid roles and constant supervision, a folded scrap of words could feel revolutionary. So you write, you risk it. You press your trembling hand to the parchment and say everything you can't say aloud. Just don't sign it too clearly. You want romance, not a church trial. Finally, a break of feast day, a harvest festival, a maypole dance. In short, a rare moment when your life isn't just work, prayer, and pretending you're not interested in the blacksmith's daughter. Today, you're allowed to flirt. Sort of, as long as no one sees. Or everyone sees, but pretends not to. Welcome to medieval festivals, where romance blooms under the watchful eyes of everyone you've ever met and 3 chickens. Festivals were one of the few socially approved moments when men and women could mingle, laugh, and dare we say make eye contact. There's music, there's ale. There's someone wearing a flower crown with dangerous confidence. You've never seen so many people not pretending to be miserable. If you're a peasant, you might try to impress your crush by winning the sack race, catching a greased pig, or juggling 3 stale rolls of bread. Nothing says I'm available like falling off a hay bale with dignity. Dancing was your best shot at actual physical contact. The rules were rigid, but a well-timed spin or a not-quite-accidental hand graze could say more than any poem. The maypole dance, for example, was basically a giant excuse for coordinated flirtation wrapped in ribbons and plausible deniability. And if you're noble, your version of flirting at a festival involved less hay and more poetry. You might compose a verse on the spot, compare your lady's eyes to twin candles or other glowing things, and offer a trinket. Hopefully not one clearly made by your servant 5 minutes earlier. Food helped too. Offer your beloved a meat pie or share a honey cake. If they accept it with a smile, you're doing well. If they hand it to their dog, start over with someone else. But remember, everything you do, someone is watching. A parent, a priest, a bard with a big mouth. One misstep and your flirty smile becomes a youthful indiscretion discussed at church for the next 6 weeks. Still, for a few hours, you can pretend. Pretend you're in a world where love isn't a transaction, where laughter isn't suspicious, and where dancing in public doesn't end in penance. Let's say you're not a knight, a noble, or a bard with a lute and excessive feelings. You're a regular villager. You wake up with the cows, go to bed with the chickens, and spend most of your day ankle-deep in mud. You're not looking for a poetic soulmate. You're looking for someone who can milk a goat without emotional drama. Welcome to peasant courtship, where romance is practical, gestures are modest, and chemistry means we can survive winter together. In your world, dating is less about long conversations and more about shared tasks. You notice someone you like because they work hard, don't complain much, and have a decent set of teeth. That's it. That's the whole checklist. You're not picky. You're realistic. You don't need fireworks. You need someone who can get a fish and maybe doesn't snore too loudly. So how do you show interest? You give gifts, small, useful things. A basket of eggs, a bundle of firewood, a good turnip. And if you're feeling bold, maybe a woven ribbon or a carved spoon. Nothing says, "I'm serious about you," like a spoon you whittled by candlelight while your pig judged you silently. Conversations happen during shared chores. You might walk together to the mill, chat while tending sheep, or exchange pleasantries while shoveling something that smells questionable. No one's reciting poetry. You're talking about the weather, crop yields, and whether or not old Thomas fell in the well again. And yet, in its own way, it's romantic. There's a sweetness in the simplicity, a shared life built not on idealism, but on cooperation. You know each other's strengths, weaknesses, and how fast they run when a goat escapes. Proposals often came quickly. If you both agreed, and the families did too, marriage followed. Maybe you moved into a shared hut. Maybe you built a new one from scratch with help from the village. You brought your best blanket. They brought a goat. Together, you began the strange miracle of domestic survival. It's not glamorous, but it's honest. You've done it. You found someone who can cook, clean, tolerate your family, and doesn't visibly recoil at the sight of your feet. True love, right? Now it's time to get married, which, in medieval terms, means you're entering into a contract, not a dreamy vow under the stars, but a legally binding transaction, often negotiated with all the passion of a livestock auction. If you're a peasant, it's still a big deal. You gather a few witnesses, talk to the local priest, and try not to trip over the Latin during the ceremony. But behind the sweet-sounding blessings is a serious checklist dowry, land rights, who gets the cow, and what happens if someone dies during planting season. Ah, yes, romance. If you're from the upper class, buckle up. Your marriage is a full-blown legal negotiation. Your parents, their parents, the priest, the scribe, maybe a cousin who once studied law, they're all in on it. The bride and groom? Mostly just standing nearby, looking decorative and nodding when spoken to. You may or may not have even met the person you're marrying. Your family has done the math. Your estate needs her fields. Her dowry balances your debts. And both of your coats of arms look good next to each other. Love is optional. The merger is not. And once you're married, it's permanent. Divorce isn't really a thing unless you can prove someone wasn't baptized, was secretly related to you, or died and forgot to mention it. Annulments existed, but they required a lot of paperwork, a bit of luck, and a solid bribe. Still, not everything is bleak. Some couples genuinely grew to love each other. Shared chores, raising children, surviving winters. These things have a way of building affection, or at least tolerance, which in medieval terms is basically the same thing. The church was involved in every step. Marriage was a holy sacrament, one of the 7 big ones. You didn't just marry for legal reasons. You married because God needed a witness, possibly 2. So you stand, exchange vows, and smile as someone hands over a sack of onions and calls it a blessing. So let's say you've had enough contracts, enough negotiations, enough being treated like a particularly valuable sack of flour. You're a noble, but for once you want to marry for love, not for land, not for lineage, not for your father's strategic ambitions. Just love. Congratulations, you're about to cause a scandal. Noble elopements were the medieval equivalent of lighting your family tree on fire and dancing in the ashes. If you ran off to marry someone of your own choosing, it wasn't just personal rebellion, it was political sabotage. Let's say your Lady Elelenina promised a suborning Vod estate secure, but you've fallen madly in love with a penniless squire who smells faintly of horses and adventure. You meet in secret, whisper sweet nothings in the stables, and one day you vanish off to a monastery where the abbot owes you a favor. There you marry under questionable legality, with only a nervous monk and 2 chickens as witnesses. Back at home chaos, your family outraged, your father threatening to siege the groom's family garden, your mother crying into her embroidery hoop, the church deeply concerned, the gossip delicious. And if you're the groom in this romantic rebellion, don't get too comfortable. Best case scenario, you get to keep your bride and your kneecaps. Worst case, you're excommunicated and disemboweled in that order. Still, some couples got away with it. If the union couldn't be undone without causing even more embarrassment, families sometimes just sighed and moved on. After all, what's done is done, and at least nobody died, hopefully. In rare cases, these scandals became legends. Songs were written, poems composed, stories whispered at banquets. 2 nobles who chose love over duty practically mythological. And yes, most noble marriages were transactional, but these moments brief rebellions, passionate escapes, whispered vows beneath moonlit towers, they reminded the world that love, though inconvenient, refused to go extinct. So if you ever feel dramatic for swiping left or turning down a second date, just remember, at least your love life doesn't involve secret weddings, angry barons, and a horse tied to a ladder outside your window. Ah, marriage, that beautiful union of 2 souls, and their respective financial portfolios. Because in the Middle Ages, love was nice, but a dowry? Now that was truly romantic. Let's say you're a bride. You're not just getting married. You're being launched like a small dowry-equipped economic vessel. Your family prepares your dowry money, livestock, land, linens, a cow or 2, depending on how lovable they think you are, and maybe even a set of pewter dishes if they're feeling generous. These offerings go to your future husband, who accepts you and your portable wealth with open arms and a mental calculator. Now flip the scenario. In some cultures or regions, it's not the bride's family giving the goods, it's the bride price. The groom pays her family for the honor of marrying her, effectively saying, here's a horse, a cloak, and 3 pigs. Now give me your daughter. Medieval romance at its finest. The point is, someone is paying someone. You're getting married, and there is absolutely a receipt involved. These exchanges weren't just about wealth. They were about status, expectations, and public statements. A large dowry might indicate a bride came from a prestigious family. A stingy one might suggest they were trying to offload her quickly, possibly, due to suspicious personality traits or a habit of talking back. You, as the bride, didn't usually get to keep your dowry. It became part of the household economy, managed by your husband, guarded by the law, and hopefully not gambled away on dice and ale within the first month of marriage. If the marriage ended through death, annulment, or your husband wandering off to join a monastery after midlife regret, your dowry could theoretically be returned. But retrieving it was often harder than pulling a sword from a stone. You'd need support, legal backing, and ideally someone who could read. Meanwhile, the bride price, if paid, was like buying a rare goat, expensive upfront and no refunds. It compensated the bride's family for the loss of her labor. After all, who's going to milk the sheep now? So while love was occasionally in the mix, money was always at the altar. So you didn't go the marriage route. Maybe you were the second son, or your dowry was suspiciously small, or you just really liked chanting. Either way, you've joined a monastery or convent. Congratulations. You've now taken a vow of poverty, chastity, and an aggressive disinterest in romance. And yet here you are, in a stone cloister, surrounded by silence, candle smoke, and Brother Anselm's unexpectedly soulful eyes. Yes, even behind monastery walls, forbidden's love found a way. To be clear, falling in love in a religious order was deeply discouraged. Like you might get whipped, exiled, or lectured by someone with a Latin name discouraged. You've sworn to give your heart entirely to God, which means giving it to literally no one else. But hearts are unruly, and sometimes prayers start sounding a lot like love poems. Maybe it starts with innocent tasks, passing each other bread in the refectory, whispering during vespers, laughing a little too hard when someone drops a hymnal. Before you know it, you're tucking extra cheese into Sister Beatrice's satchel and questioning everything. Some monks and nuns wrote passionate letters, disguised, of course, as theological musings. Your soul is a shining light in the darkness of my contemplation. Sounds holy, unless you read between the lines. And many did. There were inevitably scandalous secret meetings in the herb garden, midnight confessions that weren't strictly sacramental, and the occasional gasp-worthy discovery of a nun with a suspiciously round belly. The punishment usually harsh. Exile, public penance, or being reassigned to some far-off abbey, known mostly for sheep and silence. Still, not all stories ended in disgrace. Some lovers escaped. A few even got married after being defrocked. Most, though, returned to their cloisters, red-faced and redevoted, swearing the whole thing was just an overzealous theological debate. Because in the end, monastic life was about discipline. But humans are humans even in robes, even in silence. And sometimes, a quiet glance across the chapel was more thrilling than any tournament or courtly poem. You did it. You got married. There was a priest, a pig roast, and someone spilled mead on your mother's only nice cloak. But now it's been a few months or years, and something feels off. Maybe your spouse snores like a dying lute. Maybe they forgot to mention their chronic gambling problem. Or maybe you just realized that marrying for land and sheep doesn't automatically result in romantic bliss. Either way, welcome to the world of medieval marital disappointment. Now, don't go reaching for the divorce papers, because they don't exist. At least not in any form you'd recognize. Marriage was a sacred and unbreakable bond approved by the church, sealed by God, and enforced by public shame. You could try for an annulment, but you'd need a very good reason. We don't get along doesn't cut it. You'd have to prove that one of you is underage, already married, too closely related, or best case scenario, never consummated the marriage, which meant someone had to confirm that fact in writing, possibly under oath. Good luck. If you're a noble, it gets messier. Your marriage wasn't just personal, it was political. Trying to escape it could start a feud, ignite a scandal, or launch a minor war. Best to just quietly resent each other and attend separate feasts. So what do unhappy couples do? Mostly they just endure. You sleep in different beds. You sigh dramatically at dinner. You pour your feelings into embroidery or that one really angry song. Passive aggression becomes your love language. Of course, affairs happened usually quietly, sometimes spectacularly. Nobles had secret lovers. Peasants had suspiciously helpful neighbors. The church condemned it, of course. But that didn't stop people. It just made them better at sneaking around barns and blaming things on God's mysterious will. For women, getting out of a bad marriage was especially hard. Even if your husband was violent or vanished, society expected you to stay loyal, silent, and mildly pious while surviving off bread crusts and disapproval. Still, some people made it work. Marriages weren't always happy, but they could become partnerships, forged by hardship, habit, and the shared experience of hauling firewood in the rain. Let's say your spouse dies. Maybe it was the plague. Maybe a farm accident. Maybe they tripped over a goose in the dark. However it happened, you're now widowed, and suddenly, the medieval dating pool opens back up. Being a widow in the Middle Ages was oddly liberating. Not do whatever you want, liberating, but certainly more freedom than you had before. For women especially, widowhood often brought a taste of independence, managing land, making decisions, even speaking in public without being immediately shushed. And if you were youngish and still had teeth, you could remarry quickly, very quickly. Mourning periods existed, but so did survival instincts. A widow with land and no husband was basically a walking treasure chest. Suitors appeared with alarming speed, some sincere, others just very enthusiastic about your dairy cows. If you're a man and recently widowed, society practically pushes you back into marriage. Who else is going to cook, clean, and raise the 11 children you somehow accumulated? So you start looking, maybe the baker's daughter, maybe that quiet widow who always brings suspiciously good mead to market. Romance in second marriages could be surprisingly sweet. This time around, you're older, wiser. You're not being pushed into an alliance. You're choosing someone to survive with. Maybe even someone you like. Wild concept. Of course, there were rules. The church frowned on remarriage that happened too quickly, like, your spouse isn't too cold yet, quickly. And widows often had to negotiate with family over dowries and inheritance. Nothing says romantic second chance like arguing with your brother-in-law over who keeps the butter churn. But still, second marriages were common, even expected. Life was short. Winters were long. No one wanted to spend them alone if they didn't have to. And yes, love was part of it. Maybe not the swooning, sonnet-writing kind, but the quiet kind, based on shared stories, mutual respect, and the understanding that both of you had already seen some things. So you light the fire, pour the soup, and try again, not because it's perfect, but because it's human. You've made it this far, survived the contracts, the courtships, the chaperones, and possibly a dramatic barn elopement. But before you fall for someone new, ask yourself the most medieval question of all. Are you cosmically allowed to love this person? Because in the Middle Ages, love wasn't just a matter of the heart. It was a matter of stars, bones, and whether or not your grandmother saw a fox this morning. Let's begin with astrology. Yes, before you kissed anyone, you might want to consult the local monk astrologer. Are your signs compatible? Is Venus in retrograde? Was your beloved born under an unlucky moon? If so, better to marry someone less cursed. Love is hard enough without planetary sabotage. Then there were birthmarks, mysterious little symbols that might identify you as your soulmate's long-lost twin, or their destined executioner. Superstitions were flexible like that. But the church had its own checklist. You couldn't marry your cousin, or your second cousin, or your fourth cousin, twice removed, unless you had special permission, which the wealthy often bought, because loopholes. So before things got serious, you'd probably need to draw a family tree, and then quietly erase parts of it. Social status also mattered deeply. A noble could not fall in love with a peasant without it being declared either a miracle or a moral failing. Cross-class romance was rare, scandalous, and only acceptable if it later became a tragic folk song. And then there were the omens. If a raven flew overhead while you were thinking about someone bad sighing. If you dropped bread at dinner while glancing at your crush, forget about it. That's a cursed union. Someone might bury a charm under your doorstep to protect you from improper suitors, or to sabotage your chances. Either worked. Love in this world wasn't just personal, it was mystical. Everyone had an opinion. The stars, the saints, the weather, and that one woman in the woods who definitely wasn't a witch, except she probably was. But despite all the rules, signs, and whispered warnings, people still loved, clumsily, bravely, often against advice. Because medieval or not, the heart remains wonderfully disobedient. You've probably heard of Alexander the Great, maybe even Julius Caesar. But have you ever heard of the woman who allegedly chopped off the head of Cyrus the Great and dunked it in blood? Her name was Tamiris, and she didn't rule from a throne gilded in gold or within high-walled cities. No, her court was the open sky, her army was the wind, and her power came not from titles, but from pure, unshakable authority. She was queen of the Messagetei, a confederation of nomadic tribes who roamed the steppes of Central Asia. Think horse archers, tattooed warriors, ritual feasts, and battlefield justice. Tamiris didn't inherit her power from a pampered courtier system. She rose through grit, leadership, and possibly a healthy dose of "don't mess with me" energy. Her people were tough, accustomed to harsh winters, long migrations, and enemies on every side. But even among such people, she stood out. She was a warrior, a lawgiver, and a ruler in her own right. No husband overshadowed her. No brother guided her hand. Now, to be clear, much of what we know about Tamiris comes from the Greek historian Herodotus, a man not exactly known for his strict fact-checking. But if even a fraction of his account is true, then Tamiris wasn't just a queen. She was a storm in human form. At the heart of her story is this. A foreign superpower was growing stronger by the day, the Achaemenid Persian Empire, led by Cyrus the Great. He had already conquered Lydia and Babylon, and now his gaze turned east. The Messagetei were next on his list. But Cyrus didn't fully understand what kind of woman he was dealing with. Before the first arrow flew, before the first spear shattered, and before her son's death changed everything, Tamiris was already preparing for war, not because she wanted conquest, but because she refused submission. She wasn't just defending territory. She was defending a way of life. And as Cyrus would soon learn, there are some queens you just don't invade. Cyrus the Great had a reputation. He wasn't just any king. He was a conqueror's conqueror. The kind of man who could stroll into ancient cities, topple empires, and still get remembered fondly by historians. So when he looked east, toward the land of the Messagetei, he didn't exactly expect resistance. After all, who could possibly say no to the man who had taken Babylon without even breaking a sweat? Cyrus sent a polite offer first, because of course, every good imperialist starts with a smile. He proposed a political marriage between himself and Tamiris. Now, you might think that's romantic, but Tamiris saw right through it. She understood that this wasn't about love or even alliance. It was about control. If she married Cyrus, her kingdom would become just another province of the Persian Empire. And she, a trophy queen, she declined firmly. Cyrus, unaccustomed to rejection, didn't take it well. If he couldn't charm her into submission, he would take her kingdom by force. He crossed the Araxes River, which separated his empire from the lands of the Messagetei, and established a foothold. But Tamiris wasn't idle. She gathered her warriors, consulted her chiefs, and prepared for what she knew was coming. War. Then came the bait. Cyrus, under the guidance of his general Harpagus, laid a trap. He left a portion of his army behind, with a lavish camp overflowing with wine and food luxuries that nomads rarely indulged in. Tamiris' son, Spargopises, led a detachment to investigate. They raided the camp, took the supplies, and fatally drank the wine. The Persians returned at just the right moment, drunk, disoriented, and unprepared. Spargopises and his men were overwhelmed. He was captured alive. When Tamiris heard the news, her world cracked. This wasn't just a military loss, it was personal. Her son, her heir, was now a prisoner in Persian hands. She sent a message to Cyrus, "Give me back my son and leave. If you do not, I swear by the sun, the master of the Messagetei, I will give you your fill of blood." Cyrus didn't listen. Spargopizes, ashamed of his capture, killed himself in Persian custody. Tamiris had just lost her only son, and now she was out for blood. Grief is a powerful thing, but grief mixed with fury, that's the recipe for absolute devastation. When Tamiris learned her son, Spargopizes, had taken his own life in Persian captivity, something inside her snapped. This was no longer about borders, pride, or even independence. This was war soaked in vengeance, and Tamiris wasn't one to grieve quietly. She didn't retire to her tent in mourning robes or weep by the fire. No, the death of Cyrus, the Great, sent ripples across the ancient world. Most rulers, after such a monumental victory, would have seized power with both hands. But Tamiris chose otherwise. She returned to her people with the same steady pragmatism that had always defined her leadership. It wasn't a novelty to see a woman ride into battle. It was expected. When Tamiris took up arms, no one questioned her. Everything we know about Tamiris comes from one man, Herodotus, father of history, and of colorful exaggeration. He wrote decades after the battle, probably never spoke to a single Massagetée, and was known to favor drama over documentation. But he told her story. And that matters, because in a world of kings, tyrants, and empire builders, he paused to tell of a queen, a mother, a warrior. Her story had all the makings of legend: a noble woman, a tragic son, a cunning foe, and a battle that ended with a severed head and a chilling final word. It echoed through time, reshaped by storytellers and reimagined by artists. In the Middle Ages, she was a savage Amazon. In the Renaissance, a blood-soaked heroine, head in hand. She became symbol, cautionary tale, icon. She wasn't rebelling against a patriarchal order. She was fulfilling her place within it. Just sharper, just more cunning, just perhaps the finest among them. Their society valued action over bloodlines. Leaders weren't chosen because of who their parents were, but what they could do. And justice? It was swift, but not cruel. Communal, not bureaucratic. And over it all, the sun watched. The Massagetée worshipped the sun. In her letter to Cyrus, Tamiris swore by the sun, the divine eye, the bringer of light, the keeper of truth. To break a vow was to spit in the face of the heavens. Her story begins to fade here. There are no statues, no preserved tombs, no carved monuments. Resolute, disciplined, fierce. While the Persians had palaces and scribes, the Massagetée had memory and sky. And in one thunderous battle, it was memory and sky that prevailed. Her choice to fight not for glory, but for justice. For a son taken, for a people threatened, and for a freedom that no empire, no matter how vast, could take without a fight. She rides quietly into the fog of history, elusive, untamed, and unforgettable. Historians argue over the details. Some say Cyrus died elsewhere, that the blood-filled wineskin was poetic fiction. But even skeptics agree, someone dealt Persia a heavy blow. And it wasn't a king, it wasn't a general, it was a queen, a mother, a woman whose love for her son sparked one of the most dramatic reckonings in ancient memory. Her legacy didn't need stone to survive. It lived on the wind. And when the wind sweeps across the steppe, some say, it still whispers her name. In Babylon, Egypt, and beyond, rumors swirled. The unstoppable king had fallen, not to another empire, but to a nomadic queen. No throne, number palace. The Massagetée weren't a civilization of temples or scrolls, number columns of marble, no palaces on hills. They were nomads, warriors of the vast steppe beyond the Caspian Sea. They lived with the sky as their ceiling and the horizon as their map. Their wealth was counted in herds. Their values, strength, loyalty, and the freedom to ride wherever the wind carried them. Children were raised in saddles. Archery was instinct, and their bows small, deadly, perfect for quick strikes. Their armor wasn't polished bronze, but leather and scale, built for speed, for resilience. Just fury, grit, and a cavalry of warriors who would ride into the storm for her. And yet, Tamiris didn't exploit her victory. She didn't impose new taxes or lay claim to foreign thrones. That wasn't her way. Her justice had been served. Her son had been avenged. The Persian Empire could carry on, just not eastward. Not again. Not without remembering her name. She mounted her horse, sharpened her weapons, and swore an oath that would echo through history. She would face Cyrus in battle. She would defeat him. And she would make sure he never forgot her name, even in death. According to Herodotus, Tamiris summoned her tribal council. Under her command, the Massagetæ mobilized. Picture it, hundreds of warriors on horseback, adorned in leather armor, wielding bows and spears, faces painted with fury. They didn't march like a Persian army. They moved like a storm swift, chaotic, and with deadly precision. This time she set the trap. Cyrus, perhaps overconfident from his earlier deception, underestimated her resolve. But Tamiris knew his tactics now. She studied his movements, waited for the right moment, and then unleashed everything. The two armies clashed in what Herodotus describes as one of the bloodiest battles of the ancient world. There were no fancy formations, no grand declarations, just screaming horses, clashing blades, and a queen who fought alongside her warriors. She crushed the most powerful empire of her day, avenged her son, and ensured her name would be remembered not as a victim, but as a conqueror. And this was just the beginning of her legend. The battlefield was silent. The Persians were dead or fleeing, their legendary king lifeless in the dust. And Tamiris? She didn't celebrate like a typical victor. There were no parades, no imperial proclamations. She stood over Cyrus's body, her vengeance fulfilled, but her heart still broken. Because victory, it turned out, didn't bring peace. No silk-robed empress here. Tamiris was in the thick of it, riding hard, cutting down enemies with merciless focus. And when the dust finally settled, Cyrus the Great was dead. Tamiris, ever theatrical in her justice, had his body searched. His head was severed, placed into a wineskin filled with blood, and presented as a final offering. According to Herodotus, she spoke to it. You thirsted for blood, now drink your fill. Whether or not every detail is true is almost beside the point. What matters is that Tamiris won. The Massagetæ had won more than just a battle. They had shifted the course of empire. What's most remarkable is what she didn't do. To understand Tamiris, you must understand her people. They hunted, raided, and fought, not for conquest, but for survival. And in this culture, women fought too, not as outliers, but as equals. So Tamiris wasn't some curious anomaly. She was her people's ideal. Strange, isn't it? And yet, through the centuries, something true lingers. Something about her grit, her grief. Maybe not the exact dialogue, maybe not the wineskin, but the bones of the story. The queen, the son, the war, the victory feel too specific, too human to be pure invention. In the end, Herodotus didn't just preserve Tamiris, he mythologized her. Enlightened thinkers debated whether she was proof that women could govern wisely, or a reminder of what happens when emotions rule leadership. Tamiris wasn't the first woman to lead warriors into battle, and she certainly wasn't the last. They led in eras that pretended leadership belonged to men. There's no great tomb, no preserved armor, no marble bust in a museum. And yet, it's about a mother who lost her son. It's about a leader forced to choose between surrender and survival. It's about a person who, when cornered by one of the greatest powers the world had ever seen, chose to fight and won. In a world that often erases the names of warrior women, Tamiris persists like a blade, buried just beneath the surface always. ready to be unearthed by a new generation hungry for stories of untamed defiance. She reminds us that history isn't just kings and empires, it's also mothers and queens, grief and revenge, dirt and blood. It's the silent moments after battle, when a woman stands alone in a field littered with corpses, knowing she has changed the course of the world, but will never be fully believed. And that might be her greatest legacy, the refusal to be forgotten. No statues, no problem. Her name still rides on the wind of the steppes. Her story still makes emperors look mortal, and her legend still whispers the warning, "Come for me, and you'll drink your fill of blood." She endures. In many ways, her legacy is a paradox. Her entire story hinges on a handful of paragraphs from Herodotus, biased, embellished, possibly fictional. But those words planted a seed that refused to die. For over 2 millennia, her name has resurfaced again and again, during times when the world needed to remember that power doesn't always wear a crown or a beard. She's been reimagined through so many lenses. To Renaissance Europe, she was the noble Sabijo warning to tyrants. To modern Central Asia, she became a folk hero, a symbol of resistance and national pride, especially in countries still reckoning with colonial and imperial pasts. Statues of her rise in plazas. Children learn her name in school books. Politicians quote her when invoking strength and independence. They wielded authority not as caretakers or stand-ins, but as strategists, generals, and sovereigns. And while many male leaders were praised for their conquests, these women were often labeled dangerous, unnatural, savage. Why? Because they won. Tamiris wasn't an outlier. She was part of a global, centuries-long pattern of women who rose in times of crisis and made kings bleed. Her story, preserved by Greek pens and modern imagination, reminds us that female leadership wasn't rare. It was just rarely recorded. So when you picture ancient warfare, don't just see helmets and beards. See a queen on horseback, bow in hand, blood in her eyes, and understand, Tamiris wasn't alone. She was just one of the few they couldn't erase. But history tends to treat women like her as exceptions, isolated flashes of power in a man's world. The truth? Tamiris was part of a long, often overlooked lineage of women who ruled through the sword. Let's rewind a bit. Before Tamiris, there was Shah-Muramat, the Assyrian queen who may have inspired the mythical Semiramis, builder of cities, slayer of rebels. Around the same era, the Scythians, cultural cousins of the Massagetæ, had female warriors buried with weapons, their skeletons showing clear signs of battle injuries. These weren't ceremonial roles. These women fought, bled, and died on horseback. And after Tamiris came more. Boudica, the Celtic queen who led a fiery revolt against Rome in the 1st century CE, is often compared to her. Like Tamiris, Boudica's war was sparked by personal loss. Her daughters were assaulted, her land seized. Her response? She burned Roman settlements to ash. The parallels are uncanny: grief, vengeance, and an empire too arrogant to see what was coming. Then there was Zenobia, queen of Palmyra, who in the 3rd century CE defied Rome itself and carved out her own mini-empire in the east. She minted coins with her face. She declared independence. She made the emperor come to her. Either way, she stayed in print. But oddly enough, her own people left no records. The Massagetæ faded from history, absorbed or erased by later nomadic cultures. No carved inscriptions. No burial mounds with gold plaques reading, "Tamiris was here." Her memory survived entirely through outsider eyes. And yet, she kept reappearing. In Soviet-era Central Asia, Tamiris was reclaimed as a symbol of resistance against imperialism. Statues of her were erected in Kazakhstan and Turkmenistan. Modern scholars reevaluated her not as a bloodthirsty barbarian, but as a legitimate head of state, a woman who ruled, led armies, and negotiated from a position of strength. She has appeared in everything from documentaries to video games. In one moment, she's a playable leader in a strategy game. In the next, she's being analyzed in academic journals on gender and power. That's range. And here's the strange part. We still don't even know what she looked like. No coins, no busts, no carvings. But we know what she stood for. Strength, vengeance, autonomy, legacy. In a world that forgets queens who behave, Tamiris is remembered because she did not. And while that may blur the lines between fact and fiction, it also ensured that her name would live far longer than Cyrus's imperial edicts. Because history forgets generals, but it remembers vengeance. For a queen with no surviving monuments, Tamiris has haunted the imagination of empires for over 2,000 years. Renaissance painters adored her. She was a dramatic muse, perfect for the bloody climax of a canvas. In 1622, Rubens painted her calmly holding a severed head while courtiers looked on in awe. In another, she stands regal and composed as Cyrus' decapitated head is ceremonially dunked into a golden vessel brimming with blood. Tasteful? Maybe not. Memorable? Absolutely. To European artists, Tamiris wasn't just a historical figure, she was symbolism incarnate. A woman who punished pride, a savage noble, a cautionary tale, a feminist icon. Depending on who was holding the brush, she could represent the righteous fury of a mother, the barbarism of the East, or the wisdom of a ruler who refused to be bought. Writers loved her too. In the 18th and 19th centuries, she appeared in plays, novels, and philosophical tracts. She didn't ask to be part of history as gallery. She kicked the door down and posed for the bloodiest portrait ever painted. What binds all these women together, Tamiris include, isn't just power, it's audacity. Tamiris never built a palace. She didn't leave behind golden inscriptions or dynastic walls. But beyond the symbolism and the myth, there's something undeniably human about her story. Leadership among nomads usually flowed through clans and tribes, guided not by strict heredity, but by merit and influence. A chief or khan might rise through tactical brilliance, oratory skill, or sheer charisma. Loyalty was personal, earned in campfire councils and on windswept battlefields. But to themselves, they were guardians of freedom, masters of adaptation, and heirs to the wind. These nomadic warriors dominated lands stretching from the Black Sea to Central Asia's edges. To the Greeks, they were fearsome horsemen and exotic barbarians. Beneath these ancient mounds, archaeologists uncovered gold, intricate tattoos on preserved skin, embroidered garments, and elaborate weaponry. They were diplomats, mercenaries, and traders. Their worldview was cyclical and tied to the land, not in terms of ownership, but sacred movement. Yet they set the standard for the steppe warrior archetype, a mobile, deadly, fiercely independent fighter with no master and no fixed home. They didn't write books, but when you see a mounted archer silhouetted against the steppe horizon, that shadow belongs to the Scythians. They were the storm before the empire. Honor, or sharaf, wasn't just a word, it was social glue. A single insult could ignite a blood feud, but generosity to guests, or karam, was just as sacred. A stranger could expect food, water, and protection for 3 days, no questions asked. They knew every oasis and every star path. Their knowledge was legendary and expensive. Even today, the black tent and tribal codes remain symbols of Bedouin pride. They weren't just survivors of the desert, they were its soul. Their herds, horses, yaks, goats sustained them, and their children were raised in the saddle. Under Genghis Khan, tribal divisions were shattered and reorganized into a merit-based system. Loyalty to tribe was replaced by loyalty to the Khan, and with that, the world changed. The Mongols learned to build catapults, flaming arrows, and battering rams, and used them with chilling efficiency. Riding was a skill learned before literacy. In fact, most Mongols couldn't read. Their horse archers fired accurately at full gallop, staged fake retreats to lure enemies, and traveled over 100 miles a day. A Muslim merchant, a Christian priest, and a Buddhist monk could all travel safely under Mongol rule, as long as they didn't rebel. One day, they'd escort your caravans across the desert. The next, they'd plunder your border towns. It all depended on the mood, the season, and how well you paid. They weren't just raiders, they were strategists. They used scouts, spies, signal flags, and psychological warfare with terrifying precision. But they didn't need to. Their knowledge was encoded in songs, proverbs, and memory. Especially with Greek colonies along the Black Sea, they exchanged furs, slaves, and grain for wine, pottery, and luxury goods. They needed tools, textiles, spices, and luxury goods. In exchange, they offered livestock, furs, leather, salt, and exotic items. They conquered cities, but never truly belonged to them, because no matter how high they climbed, they always rode with the wind at their backs. The Mongol Empire connected the world in ways never seen before. They revived and protected the Silk Road, ensuring safe passage from China to Europe. Goods, ideas, and even diseases like the Black Death traveled their vast network. Battle wasn't about mass slaughter, but survival, prestige, and honor. Poets were warriors of words, their verses preserving history, shaming enemies, and praising heroes. Poetry passed from memory to memory, often performed in song-like cadence around the fire. Some poems became tribal law, others became legacy. A successful raid elevated a man's status. A failed one could stain a tribe's reputation for generations. Greek writers both admired and feared them. Herodotus described strange customs, like drinking the blood of enemies or using scalps as napkins. Life moved with camels, known as the ships of the desert. Camels were transport, food, clothing, and currency, all at once. But he also praised their justice and loyalty to kin. In the 13th century, these steppe riders erupted from the plains of Mongolia, carving out the largest contiguous land empire in history. But their roots were no different from other nomadic cultures. They followed mobile, clan-based, fiercely adaptive life on the Mongolian steppe, brutal and demanding. Their swirling animal art style reflected a life bound deeply to nature and the hunt. To themselves, they were a people of freedom, vengeance, and pride. They left few ruins behind, but reshaped the world every time they rode. Far from isolated, nomads were the connective tissue of the ancient world, moving silk from China, spices from India, silver from Persia, and slaves from Europe. These nomadic caravans and traders were the original transcontinental couriers, long before empires caught on. Originating in the vast deserts of the Arabian Peninsula, the Bedouin were not merely wanderers, but engineers of survival, mastering some of Earth's most inhospitable terrain. Unlike the thunderous charge of steppe nomads, Bedouin life was quieter, more deliberate, built around the rhythms of desert drought and rainfall, grazing routes, and the movements of stars. And when trade broke down, they raided swift, strategic, and terrifyingly efficient. Their history wasn't carved in stone, but sung and recited. Elders passed down legends, laws, and identity through oral tradition. A tribe's entire legal system, history, and soul could live in the memory of a single bard or elder. Stories weren't mere entertainment. They were instruction, governance, and community. To empires, nomads seemed unpredictable, alien, and dangerous. Long before the Mongols thundered across Eurasia, the Scythians ruled the windswept steppe between the 9th and 2nd centuries BCE. Scythian society was built around mobility and violence. Boys learned to ride before they could walk properly. Their weapons were practical and deadly short composite bows perfect for shooting at full gallop, curved swords, battle axes, and iron-tipped spears. The Scythian warrior wasn't just a man. Archaeological finds reveal that women fought 2 female skeletons buried with weapons, marked by battle wounds that only real combat could leave. Though they didn't build cities, Their burial mounds, known as kurgans, preserved their legacy. But the Scythians were more than wild raiders. Their religion was primal and animistic. They worshipped gods of war, fire, and fertility. Some rituals involved cannabis smoke, others horse sacrifice. Eventually, pressured by other nomadic groups like the Sarmatians, and boxed in by growing empires, the Scythians faded into history. While the Scythians ruled the grasslands, the Bedouins carved their legacy into sand. Their home was the black goat hair tent, or bedels portable, breathable and easy to pack. The Bedouin were famed for their tribal structure, where loyalty to kin came before all else. Their warfare was rooted in the raid, or gazoo, fast, strategic attacks designed to capture goods and livestock without unnecessary bloodshed. Yet Bedouin life was not only conflict and sandstorms. It was rich in oral tradition. Trade caravans also passed through Bedouin lands. These tribesmen served as guides, protectors, and sometimes smugglers, moving incense, spices, and silk from southern Arabia to the Levant and beyond. Though many Bedouins later integrated into cities and empires, they maintained a fierce sense of identity. No nomadic people reshaped the world quite like the Mongols. The Mongols lived in Gare circular felt tents that could be assembled in under an hour and packed onto carts the next morning. What made the Mongols different was how they weaponized mobility. Mongol warfare was a ballet of speed and deception. Once they began conquering cities, they adapted quickly. Siege engineers from China and Persia joined their ranks. But here's the twist. They weren't just destroyers. They introduced paper currency, passport systems, and religious tolerance across their realm. And yet, they remained nomads at heart. Even as they governed empires, Mongol rulers still returned to their tents, their herds, and the open steppe. To the sedentary empires, nomads were either useful or dangerous, and sometimes both. But to nomads, the line between trade and raid was negotiable. Trade was vital to nomadic life. Most nomads couldn't grow grain or make pottery. Some traded falcons or rare horses, while others acted as middlemen between distant lands, forming crucial links along the Silk Road, the incense route, and other transcontinental paths. These weren't tales told for amusement. They were lessons, warnings, and laws. The secret history of the Mongols, first recited by heart and only written down much later, tells not just of Genghis Khan's rise, but of the values that defined their world loyalty, fate, revenge, and ambition. It is no dry record, but a living saga meant to teach and unify. Among the Bedouins, poetry reigned supreme. A well-crafted verse could shame an enemy, honor a fallen warrior, or settle a dispute. Poets, or sheikh, advised tribal leaders. Remembered more clearly than many chiefs, their words could ignite war or stop it cold. Entire epics were passed word for word, generation after generation. But these were no ordinary merchant caravans. They traveled as armed convoys, ready to defend themselves or strike if needed. A tribal leader might negotiate with a border governor 1 week. When Greek writers like Herodotus captured these tales, they echoed a far older spoken tradition history, passed around campfires, not chiseled in stone. Then raid his storehouses the next. But it also had one profound advantage: it lived. It was adaptable, flexible, and deeply human. It allowed nomadic societies to retain identity long after migrations, defeats, or cultural absorption. Empires may crumble and their archives turn to dust, but nomadic stories survived. Not because they were written down, but because they were breathed into life. As long as someone remembered, nothing was truly lost. Empires called this treachery. Nomads called it options. The Scythians, for instance, traded grain and gold with Greek cities by the Black Sea, but if cheated, they burned those cities to ashes. The Bedouins protected caravans laden with incense and spices across Arabia, until protection fees went unpaid. Then the camels quietly changed course. Under Genghis Khan, the Mongols first sought peaceful trade with the Khwarezmian Empire. When their merchants were executed, scrolls, or printing presses, how did nomads preserve their history? The answer was simple and powerful. They remembered. Oral tradition was more than storytelling. It was their library, courtroom, constitution, and mythology, all woven into memory. From Scythian grasslands to Mongol plains and Bedouin deserts, memory was sacred and the tongue sharper than the sword. They responded with swift, devastating force, annihilating entire cities. To the nomadic mind, trade was personal and political. It wasn't just business, it was a reflection of respect. If a settled kingdom treated nomads as equals, commerce flourished. If not, punishment came swiftly, and usually on horseback. This tension gave rise to a curious balance. Border economies towns on the edge of nomadic lands became hybrid spaces, part military outpost, part bustling market. Governors bribed chieftains, tribes traded news, horses, and intelligence. Sometimes marriages sealed fragile peace.